The morning of the auction, there were 35 scrub sheep nobody wanted. They stood huddled in the furthest holding pen of the county livestock exchange, a patchwork of matted wool, hollow flanks, and defeated eyes, pressing together as if the sheer density of their shivering bodies might protect them from the relentless, dusty wind that swept through the valley. The air in the auction yard was thick with the sharp, acidic tang of ammonia, the heavy exhaust of idling diesel trucks, and the rhythmic, auctioneering chant that echoed from the loudspeakers like a frantic, mechanical heartbeat. It was a Tuesday in early April, the kind of morning where the frost still clung stubbornly to the shadows of the aluminum gates, and the men who populated the bleachers were not there to gamble on lost causes. These were men of commerce, men of yield and margin, dressed in heavy canvas work coats and scuffed leather boots, their faces weathered by decades of calculating the exact price of a pound of flesh. They leaned against the heavy iron railings, holding styrofoam cups of black coffee, their eyes scanning the prime stock, the heavy-chested Angus crossbreeds, the pristine, blocky meat sheep that promised a quick and profitable turnaround. The 35 animals in the back pen were a rounding error, a nuisance lot brought in from a foreclosed property on the stony edge of the county, animals that had been left to fend for themselves on barren pasture until they were little more than walking architecture, their ribs casting long shadows under the harsh fluorescent lights of the arena. They were the kind of animals that buyers looked past, relegated to the category of special cases, dog food, or quiet tragedies that were best ignored in the pursuit of a healthy balance sheet. She walked past the valuable stock without breaking her stride. She was a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, though the set of her jaw and the quiet, heavy stillness in her shoulders made her seem older, carrying the invisible weight of a life that had recently, and quietly, disassembled itself. She had returned to this rural county only 3 weeks prior, retreating from a nameless, sprawling city where she had spent 5 years pouring her energy into a career that had evaporated overnight, leaving her with nothing but a cardboard box of office supplies and a profound, echoing sense of failure. She had come back to the only place left to her, a neglected, multi-generational family farm inherited from her late grandfather, a property that the rest of the family had viewed as a burden and that she now viewed as a final, desperate anchor. She did not have a grand agricultural plan. She did not have a bank loan or a shiny new tractor. She had only a modest savings account, a deep, unmoored ache in her chest, and a stubborn refusal to be broken twice in 1 year. She moved through the crowded walkways of the auction yard with a deliberate, unhurried pace, her boots stepping softly over the sawdust and manure, until she reached the rusted mesh of the back pen. She stopped there, resting her hands on the cold metal, and observed the rejected flock for a long time, longer than seemed reasonable to the casual observer. She watched the way they breathed, the shallow, rapid rise and fall of their sides. She watched how they reacted to the noise of the yard, not with panic, but with a dull, enduring stoicism. She saw the weakness, the parasites, the terrible condition of their fleeces, but beneath that, she saw something else, something that resonated with the quiet, battered resilience she was trying to cultivate within herself. She saw survival. When the lot was finally driven into the main ring, the auctioneer barely bothered to build up his chant. He rattled off a starting price so low it was almost an insult, a price that reflected the general consensus that these animals would not survive a hard transition to a new pasture. The men in the bleachers checked their phones, adjusted their caps, and engaged in low murmurs about the weather, completely ignoring the scrawny, bleeding mass of wool in the sawdust below. The auctioneer dropped the price again, his voice echoing flatly against the corrugated tin roof, asking for a courtesy bid, a salvage price, anything to clear the ring and move on to the profitable stock. The silence in the arena was heavy, punctuated only by the nervous shuffling of the sheep's hooves. It was the silence of communal rejection. She raised her white cardboard bidding number, holding it steady and high. The auctioneer paused, blinking through the harsh light, surprised that anyone had taken the bait. He acknowledged her bid with a quick nod and asked the room for a counter, but the request was purely theatrical. No one was going to fight her for a pen full of walking liabilities. The gavel came down with a sharp, wooden crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room, sealing the transaction. She had bought the entire lot for a price that barely covered the cost of the auction house's paperwork. As she lowered her card, a ripple of movement passed through the bleachers. Thomas Vance, a man whose name was synonymous with modern, aggressive, high-yield farming in the valley, leaned over the railing, a wide, mocking grin splitting his ruddy face. Vance was a man who measured success in tonnage and chemical inputs, a man whose pristine, laser-leveled fields were a testament to his belief that nature was an adversary to be beaten into submission with heavy machinery and synthetic nitrogen. He was an established, respected figure, the kind of man whose opinions dictated the local agricultural consensus, and he did not miss an opportunity to publicly assert his dominance. "Bought yourself 35 head of coyote bait, did you?" Vance's voice boomed across the arena, carrying easily over the ambient noise. A chorus of rough, easy laughter erupted from the men around him. "I hope you got a backhoe to dig the trench, sweetheart, because you just bought 1,000 funerals. You'll be burying them before the month is out. That is a pure, unadulterated waste of money." She did not flush. She did not look away. She turned her head slowly, meeting Vance's amused, condescending gaze with a look of profound, undisturbed calm. She did not offer a defense, nor did she attempt to explain the vague, intuitive pull that had driven her to raise her card. She simply let the laughter wash over her, recognizing it for what it was. The predictable noise of men who only understood value when it was polished and presented to them on a platter. She nodded once, a minimal, almost imperceptible acknowledgement of his words, and turned her back to the bleachers to finalize the paperwork. He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. If you are enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to tap the like button. And while you are at it, leave a comment telling me the name of the town or city you are watching from, because I read every single one and I like knowing where these stories travel. Now, let us return to the valley, and to the slow, unglamorous work of proving the world wrong. The drive back to the farm was a slow, rattling journey along winding two-lane roads that climbed steadily away from the prosperous, irrigated floor of the valley and into the rugged, shadowed foothills. The livestock trailer she had borrowed hitched and swayed behind her old truck, carrying a cargo so light she barely felt the drag on the engine. As she drove, the landscape shifted. The uniform, manicured blocks of commercial vineyards and massive, pivot-irrigated alfalfa fields gave way to wilder, broken country, where the soil was thin and rocky, and the oak trees grew twisted and low against the prevailing winds. This was the forgotten edge of the county, the land that the modern agricultural boom had left behind because it could not be easily subjugated by massive tractors or flooded with cheap water. This was where her family's land sat, 200 acres of steep hillsides, deep ravines, and neglected pastures that had been slowly succumbing to the encroaching wilderness for the better part of 2 decades. When she finally pulled the truck through the rusted iron gates and parked near the main house, the sheer scale of the neglect was staggering. The old farmhouse, a sturdy 2-story structure of native stone and heavy timber, sat with a sagging porch and peeling white paint, looking out over the valley with the weary resignation of an abandoned sentinel. The main barn leaned heavily to the east, its silvered boards groaning under the weight of a century of shifting winds, the roofline dipping like the swayback of a tired draft horse that had pulled too many plows through unyielding clay. But it was not the buildings that drew her attention. It was the land itself. The pastures were a chaotic tangle of invasive star thistle, dense, thorny blackberry brambles, and towering weeds that choked out the native grasses. And there, on the steepest, most sun-drenched hillside behind the house, completely entombed in a fortress of wild brush and climbing vines, were the remnants of her grandfather's legacy. They were grapevines, 35 ancient, gnarled, thick-trunked grapevines, a forgotten, unnamed varietal that her grandfather had refused to pull up when the rest of the valley was tearing out their old orchards and vineyards to plant the highly profitable, heavily irrigated, fashionable clones demanded by the modern wine market. Her grandfather had been a stubborn man, a man who believed that the land should dictate the crop, not the other way around. He had argued that these old vines, deep-rooted and dry-farmed, produced a fruit that carried the true voice of the soil, a complexity that could not be replicated by watering shallow roots and pumping them full of synthetic fertilizers. The valley had laughed at him then, just as Thomas Vance had laughed at her today. As her grandfather grew too old to fight the briars, the vineyard had been swallowed by the wild, becoming a tangled, impenetrable thicket, the vines themselves lost beneath a suffocating blanket of invasive growth. The family had urged him to sell, to clear the land, to conform, but he had held on with a quiet, fierce grip until the day he died. When she inherited the property, the general consensus among her relatives was that she should immediately bulldoze the hillside, sell the wood, and subdivide the acreage. But instead of scattering, something in her had settled when she walked this overgrown land. She decided not to sell the burden, but to understand it. She unloaded the 35 ragged sheep into a small, heavily fenced holding pen near the barn, providing them with clean water and a modest ration of high-quality hay, careful not to shock their starved systems. She watched them eat, their movements slow and cautious, and felt a strange kinship with the broken animals. They were tools, yes, biological clearing machines that she desperately needed because she could not afford the heavy equipment required to clear the hillside, but they were also companions in her exile. She left them to rest and walked up the creaking wooden steps of the farmhouse, pushing open the heavy front door. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper, dried lavender, and the fine, gray dust that settles over a place when life departs from it. She walked through the silent rooms, her boots echoing on the hardwood floors, until she reached her grandfather's study at the back of the house. It was exactly as he had left it years ago, a sanctuary of organized clutter. The heavy oak desk was covered in stacks of faded agricultural bulletins, soil maps, and a collection of smooth river stones used as paperweights. She sat down in his worn leather chair, the springs groaning in familiar protest, and began to open the drawers. She was looking for a deed, a property line map, anything to help her make sense of the boundaries of her inheritance. Instead, in the bottom right drawer, beneath a heavy, tarnished brass compass, she found a stack of 6 thick, leather-bound ledgers. She pulled the first one out, brushing the dust from the cover, and opened it. The pages were filled with her grandfather's cramped, meticulous handwriting, a sprawling, decades-long record of his life on the land. But these were not simple farm logs recording dates of planting and yields of harvest. They read like the field notes of a man studying something he loved with a desperate, consuming passion. There were detailed, patient observations about the exact angle of the sun on the south-facing slope in late October, the way the fog settled in the lower ravines during the spring frosts, the specific types of native clovers that emerged after a heavy rain, and the subtle, shifting behaviors of the local wildlife. She turned the pages, mesmerized by the depth of his attention. He had recorded the soil temperatures, the moisture levels at different depths, the intricate relationships between the insects, the birds, and the health of the plants. As she read deeper into the night, a single, recurring phrase began to leap out at her, heavily underlined in dark blue ink: "The ground remembers." It was not a mystical statement, but a deeply practical ecological thesis. He wrote extensively about the folly of the modern, forceful methods sweeping the valley, the deep plowing that destroyed the soil structure, the chemical sprays that killed the beneficial microbes, the constant, arrogant demand for maximum yield at the expense of long-term resilience. He argued that the old vines, those 35 survivors on the hill, possessed a generational memory of drought, of heat, of poor years and abundant years, and that their deep roots tapped into a moisture and mineral reserve that the pampered, shallow-rooted modern vines could never reach. He wrote about using animals not as commodities to be fattened and sold, but as partners in managing the land, detailing how the targeted grazing of sheep could clear underbrush without damaging the soil crust, how their hooves would break up the hardpan and press native seeds into the earth, and how their manure would slowly rebuild the depleted organic matter. The ledgers were a blueprint, a masterclass in a patient, holistic way of farming that the world had rushed past and forgotten. She closed the ledger as the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the dusty window panes. A quiet, terrifying resolve had crystallized in her chest. She did not need a tractor. She did not need Thomas Vance's approval. She had the 35 sheep, she had the 35 vines, and she had the accumulated wisdom of a man who had understood the long game. Later that week, She drove out to the far edge of the county to visit the only living person who might truly understand what she was attempting to do. Great-Aunt Martha was in her late 80s, a fierce, solitary woman who lived in a small, impeccably neat cabin surrounded by towering Douglas firs. Martha wore practical men's work trousers, heavy flannel shirts, and possessed a gaze that could strip the bark off a hickory tree. She was the sister of the grandfather who had written the ledgers, and she was known for being terse, economical with her words, and deeply, unfailingly observant. When the young woman arrived, Martha was sitting on her porch, snapping green beans into a tin bucket. She did not stop working as her great-niece approached. The young woman sat on the wooden steps, the smell of wood smoke and peppermint tea wrapping around her, and explained what she had done. She told Martha about the auction, the mockery, the 35 ragged sheep, the overgrown hillside, and the ledgers she had found in the desk. She spoke for a long time, laying out her fragile, hopeful plan to use the sheep to clear the brush and resurrect the ancient vines, returning to the methods their grandfather had championed. Martha listened in complete silence, her ancient, arthritic hands moving with rhythmic precision, breaking the beans with sharp, wet snaps. When the young woman finally finished, the silence stretched out, heavy and expectant, filled only by the wind moving through the high branches of the fir trees. The young woman braced herself for a lecture on financial prudence, a warning about the risks of romanticizing the past, or a gentle suggestion to sell the land and move on. Finally, Martha dropped the last handful of beans into the bucket, wiped her hands on a coarse cotton towel, and looked directly at her great-niece. Her eyes, pale and sharp as winter ice, held a glimmer of something that looked remarkably like fierce, quiet pride. "When you bought those sheep," Martha said, her voice gravelly and low, "did you buy the ones that stood at the edge of the pen, trying to climb the fence, or did you buy the ones that stood in the middle, holding their ground?" The young woman blinked, surprised by the specificity of the question. "They were huddled in the middle. They weren't fighting the fence. They were just enduring." Martha gave a single curt nod. "Those are the ones. The fighters wear themselves out. The endurers survive the winter. Your grandfather knew that. The valley forgot it. Put them on the hill. Let them work. And do not let the noise of fools rush your hands." That was all she said. It was the only blessing, and the only instruction, the young woman needed. The work that followed was slow, agonizing, and entirely unglamorous. It was the kind of invisible, grinding labor that is utterly devoid of romance and mostly invisible to anyone who was not paying the closest attention. She began by constructing a complex system of temporary, electrified netting on the steep hillside, sectioning off small paddocks around the towering thickets of briar and weed that entombed the old vines. She moved the 35 sheep into the first paddock, and they went to work. They were ravenous, and their desperate hunger turned out to be the greatest asset she possessed. They tore into the invasive star thistle, stripped the leaves from the thorny blackberry canes, and trampled the tall, dry weeds into the earth. Because they were scrub sheep, accustomed to rough forage, they thrived on the marginal diet that would have sickened a pampered, grain-fed flock. Every day she moved the fencing, rotating the flock across the hillside, allowing them to clear a section and then moving them before they could damage the soil or begin to gnaw on the thick, ancient bark of the grapevines. It was a delicate, exhausting dance. She spent her days hauling water in heavy buckets up the steep incline, mending broken wires by hand, her fingers bleeding from the thorns, her muscles burning with a deep, persistent ache. She spent her evenings sitting on the porch, a notebook on her lap, recording her own observations, tracking the recovery of the sheep, the slow exposure of the vines, and the subtle changes in the soil texture, continuing the dialogue her grandfather had started decades before. Down in the valley, at the local feed store and the equipment co-op that served as the county's true circulatory system for gossip and news, her efforts were a constant source of amusement. Thomas Vance and his lieutenants would stand by the loading docks, leaning against their immaculate, heavy-duty pickup trucks, and trade jokes about the crazy girl on the hill who was trying to farm with weeds and coyotes. Whenever she came into town to buy essential supplies, a roll of wire, a bag of mineral salt, a replacement handle for a broken hoe, They would greet her with a false, heavy-handed friendliness, asking how her world-class operation was proceeding, or inquiring if she had managed to harvest a bumper crop of thistle yet. She never took the bait. Her demeanor was a fortress of quiet, unshakable calm. When Vance would loudly ask how her ragged sheep were doing, she would answer plainly, without heat or defensiveness. "They are eating well, thank you." Her level, non-reactive tone took the fun out of the question, leaving the mockers in an awkward, hollow silence. She did not argue with them, just as she did not argue with the weather or the rocky soil. She knew that arguing with men who were convinced of their own superiority was a waste of energy better spent on the hillside. But she was not entirely without allies. Elias Pratt, an old-timer who owned the feed store and who had known her grandfather, observed these exchanges silently from behind the worn wooden counter. Elias was a man who spoke rarely, but whose memory was long. One afternoon, after Vance and his crew had left, leaving a trail of snide remarks in their wake, Elias pushed her receipt across the counter and tapped a gnarled finger on the wood. "Your grandfather used to buy his wire here," Elias said softly, his eyes fixed on the ledger in front of him. "They laughed at him, too, when he refused to pull those old vines. Said he was standing in the way of progress. But I remember the wine he made from that hill. Tasted like the earth itself had something to say. You keep your head down, girl. Water finds its level." It was a small, private confirmation, a vital drop of encouragement that she carried back up the mountain like a talisman. By the end of the second year, the invisible work began to manifest in ways that could no longer be ignored. The 35 scrub sheep, once hollow and defeated, had transformed. The constant movement, the diverse forage, and the absence of stress had turned them into a robust, muscular flock. Their fleeces, once matted and parasite-ridden, grew in thick and heavy, carrying the natural oils and resilience of animals that belonged to the landscape. More importantly, the hillside had been transformed. The impenetrable thickets of briar were gone, replaced by a low, manageable understory of native clovers and deep-rooted perennial grasses that the sheep's hooves had seeded and their manure had fertilized. And standing clear and free in the center of this restored ecosystem were the 35 ancient vines. They looked like gnarled, wooden sculptures, their trunks thick as a man's thigh, twisted by decades of wind and struggle. When the spring warmed the soil, a soil that was now dark, spongy, and rich with the biological life that the sheep had returned to it, the vines awoke. They did not push out the explosive, watery, frantic growth of the heavily fertilized commercial vines in the valley. Instead, they pushed out small, tight, deeply green leaves, followed by compact, intensely concentrated clusters of grapes. That autumn, she harvested the grapes by hand, working alone on the quiet hillside, filling small wooden crates with the dark, heavy fruit. The yield was tiny, a fraction of what a commercial block would produce, but the quality was undeniable. She crushed the grapes using a small, hand-cranked press she had found in the barn, fermenting the juice in a pair of old, neutral oak barrels, following the meticulous, minimalist instructions her grandfather had left in his ledgers. She intervened as little as possible, letting the wild yeasts on the grape skins drive the fermentation, allowing the wine to express the exact, unadulterated character of the restored hillside. When she finally tasted the finished wine the following spring, she sat in the dark cellar and wept quietly. It was complex, earthy, carrying notes of dark fruit, dried herbs, and a profound, stony minerality. Tasted of survival, tasted of time. She noted the success in her notebook without ceremony, a simple entry recording the vintage, but she allowed herself a long moment to sit with the deep, resonant satisfaction of a promise fulfilled. She began to sell the wine, and a small number of the finest lambs, to a few select, high-end restaurants in the city she had fled, places where chefs and sommeliers were desperately searching for authenticity in a market flooded with mass-produced uniformity. She did not create a flashy label or a marketing campaign. The enterprise was simply named after the farm, and the product spoke for itself with a quiet, devastating authority. The wine was different. The meat was different. It was fundamentally superior, carrying a density of flavor that could only be achieved through time, patience, and a deep partnership with the land. But the true vindication, the moment that irrevocably shifted the balance of power in the valley, arrived in her 4th year on the farm, carried on the back of a disaster. It started in the winter, a winter that brought no snow to the mountains and no rain to the valleys. By spring, the soil was already dry, cracking open in deep, thirsty fissures. By midsummer, it was officially declared the worst drought in living memory. The heat settled over the county like a suffocating, heavy blanket, relentless and brutal. The massive, engineered reservoirs that the conventional farmers relied upon to flood their fields began to drop precipitously, exposing vast expanses of cracked, dead mud. The local water authority issued emergency curtailments, drastically reducing the amount of water the large agricultural operations could pump. Panic swept through the valley. The modern, high-yield vineyards, with their shallow, pampered root systems that had been trained to expect water on demand, began to collapse. The leaves turned yellow, then a crispy, dead brown, dropping from the wires and leaving the grapes to shrivel and burn in the relentless sun. The massive alfalfa fields turned to dust, blowing away in the hot wind. Farmers who had leveraged themselves to the hilt, carrying massive debts for heavy machinery and chemical inputs, found themselves staring at total crop failure. The auction yards, the very place where the story had begun, were suddenly flooded with desperate men selling off their prime, grain-fed livestock at a massive loss because they could no longer afford to feed or water them. The valley turned brown, a landscape of withered ambition and brittle, failing infrastructure. But the farm on the hill remained a green island in a brown county. It was a sight that defied the conventional logic of every farmer in the valley. While the million-dollar commercial vineyards died of thirst, the 35 ancient vines on the steep, rocky slope thrived. Their roots, forced by decades of dry farming to dive dozens of feet into the bedrock, tapped into deep, hidden aquifers and mineral reserves that the drought could not touch. The soil around them, protected by the thick, living mulch of native grasses and clover, and enriched by years of targeted sheep grazing, held onto every drop of morning dew, acting like a massive subterranean sponge. The sheep themselves, adapted to harsh conditions and moving constantly under her careful management, remained fat and healthy, seeking shade under the great oak trees during the heat of the day and grazing the resilient, deep-rooted forage in the cool of the evening. The contrast was so stark, so visually impossible, that people began to drive out to the edge of the county just to look at it. They would park their dusty trucks on the shoulder of the road and stand by the rusted iron gates, staring up at the vibrant, emerald-green hillside rising out of the parched, dying landscape. They saw the fat, contented sheep resting in the shade. They saw the heavy, dark clusters of grapes hanging beneath a thick canopy of healthy leaves. They were looking at a miracle, but it was not a miracle of divine intervention. It was a miracle of profound, patient observation, a victory of ancestral wisdom over modern force. It was late August, at the absolute peak of the drought's devastation, when the dust plume of a single heavy-duty pickup truck announced the arrival of a visitor. The truck pulled slowly through the gates and stopped near the sagging barn. The door opened and Thomas Vance stepped out. He looked older, his ruddy face drawn and tight with the stress of watching his empire wither under the sun. He did not have his lieutenants with him. He walked slowly up the dirt path toward the hillside, where she was kneeling in the dirt, checking the tension on a section of fencing. She stood up as he approached, wiping the dirt from her hands on her canvas trousers, her face an unreadable mask of calm. She did not smile, nor did she cross her arms defensively. She simply waited. Vance stopped a few feet away. He took off his expensive felt hat, holding it in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. He looked past her, up the hill, his eyes tracing the thick, healthy trunks of the ancient vines, the dark, moist soil beneath them, and the flock of robust sheep grazing peacefully in the distance. He stood there for a long time, the silence stretching out between them, broken only by the dry wind rattling the dead branches of a nearby oak. When he finally spoke, his loud, booming voice was gone, replaced by a quiet, gravelly tone that sounded entirely unfamiliar. He did not offer a grand apology, for men like Vance did not know how to say they were sorry. Instead, he offered a plain, unadorned admission of fact, spoken not as praise, but as a kind of grievance against the order of things he had always believed in. "I was wrong," Vance said softly, looking directly at the soil beneath his boots. "I was wrong about the sheep. I was wrong about the vines. I was wrong about the whole damn thing." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, carrying the heavy, exhausted weight of a man whose worldview had just been dismantled. "My shallow roots are dead. My fields are dust. And you are sitting on the only green hill in the county." He paused, swallowing hard. "I need to know how you did it. I need to know what you know." She looked at him, seeing not the arrogant bully who had mocked her at the auction, but a desperate, humbled farmer facing the ruin of his life's work. She felt no desire to gloat, no urge to throw his past words back in his face. The victory was already complete, written in the vibrant green of the leaves and the dark richness of the soil. The worth of her grandfather's knowledge had proven itself, and it did not need to argue. "It is not a secret, Mr. Vance," she said quietly, her voice carrying the steady, rhythmic cadence of the land she had come to know. "It is just slow. It requires you to stop telling the land what it has to do, and start asking it what it remembers." She did not turn him away. Over the coming weeks, as the drought dragged on, Vance became a frequent, quiet visitor. He would walk the hillside with her, leaving his truck at the gate, asking terse, specific questions about soil compaction, rotational grazing, and the deep-root structure of the ancient vines. He asked to buy a dozen of her young rams to begin transitioning his own failing, weed-choked back pastures, paying full price without a word of negotiation. Vance's quiet conversion did what her own success alone could not. It broke the dam of community skepticism. If Thomas Vance, the high priest of modern, chemical farming, was walking the hill and taking notes, the rest of the valley could no longer pretend she was a crazy girl playing in the dirt. Other established farmers began to visit, men who had laughed at her in the feed store, arriving with a hesitant, respectful curiosity. She became a teacher, sharing the knowledge from her grandfather's ledgers freely, walking them through the fields, letting them plunge their hands into the cool, damp earth beneath the vines to feel the life that the sheep had cultivated. Faced with a sudden, overwhelming demand for her wine, her breeding stock and her consultation, she remained deeply grounded in the financial prudence she had learned from the ledgers. She refused to take on debt to expand rapidly. She refused to buy massive stainless steel tanks or build a glossy tasting room. She grew only the way the land could grow, letting the demand pull the operation forward organically, saving the capital, ensuring that the farm would never again be vulnerable to the whims of the bank or the pressure of a bad year. The following spring, a serious, quiet local teenager named David began walking up the long driveway after school, asking if he could help with the heavy work. He was a boy who spoke little, but who possessed a calm, steady demeanor around the animals. She paid him a fair wage and began to teach him, watching as he intuitively absorbed the rhythm of the rotational grazing, the careful observation of the vines, and the patient, holistic philosophy that underpinned it all. He had the hands for the work, and in his silent, diligent presence, she saw the future, the successful transmission of the ancestral legacy to a new generation that would not forget the lessons of the drought. It was a bittersweet legacy, for the feeling of success was inextricably mixed with the quiet grief that the ancestors who would be proudest were not there to stand on the hill and see it. But late that summer, she brought a bottle of the new vintage, the wine born from the heart of the drought, to the small cabin in the woods. Great Aunt Martha was frail now, her sharp eyes clouded, confined to a rocking chair by the window. The young woman poured a small measure of the dark red wine into a glass and placed it in the old woman's trembling hand. Martha brought it to her lips, tasted it, and closed her eyes. She sat in silence for a long time, the taste of the deep earth, the resilient vines, and the long, slow victory lingering on her palate. When she finally opened her eyes, she looked at her great-niece and gave a single, satisfied nod. She passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 days later, her final transfer of the wise elder mantle complete, knowing the land was in hands that understood its memory. The story ends where it began, in the dusty, echoing arena of the county livestock exchange. It was a Tuesday in early April, the frost clinging to the metal gates, the air thick with the smell of diesel and animals. She stood in the bleachers, not as an unmoored outsider, but as a respected pillar of the agricultural community, her quiet confidence radiating like heat from a stone. Beside her sat young David, holding a bidding card, learning the subtle art of reading the true value of an animal. Down in the ring, a lot of rough, unkempt yearling ewes were driven into the sawdust, animals that had been neglected on a marginal property, looking confused and defensive. The auctioneer started the chant low, expecting no interest from the men in the bleachers who still favored the heavy, polished stock. She leaned over and murmured a few quiet words to David. The boy nodded, his face serious, and raised the white cardboard number high in the air. A murmur went through the crowd, but this time, no one laughed. Thomas Vance, sitting a few rows down, turned and gave her a respectful, knowing nod, recognizing exactly what she was doing. The community now understood the profound value of what she saw in the rejected thing. They understood that the ragged sheep were not a liability, but the key to unlocking the power of the land, the very tools that had built the most resilient, profitable, and celebrated farm in the valley. It is a story that the old men at the feed store now tell to the young farmers who come in asking about synthetic fertilizers and heavy plows. It is a story that proves that the rejected thing is often the most valuable thing, if you only possess the wisdom to know how to read it. It proves that patience consistently beats money, that deep, careful attention will always outlast brute force, and that true worth does not need to argue loudly for its place in the world, because in the end, when the dry years come and the easy methods fail, true worth simply and quietly proves itself. If the story resonated with you, I ask that you share it with someone who might feel like they are not worth much right now, someone who needs to hear that survival is a quiet kind of victory. And please, tell me about the thing in your own life that everybody laughed at. The small, stubborn thing you kept on with anyway, despite the noise of the fools. Leave it in the comments below because I read every comment. Everyone. I will read yours.